Two things are likely to come to your mind whenever you hear about cosmic horror. Either one of the acclaimed writers or the monsters. And indeed, classic cosmic horror generally encapsulates the concepts of madness and magnitude in a rather specific form. A work that is Lovecraft-coded will probably include something with ancient rituals, giant squid gods, and even a bit of racism if you're feeling traditional. But I wouldn't say that those are the characteristics that exactly define cosmic horror as a genre. As a matter of fact, they are one of many different ways to portray it. Let me give you a few examples. The Wikipedia definition of cosmic horror is a type of horror that puts more emphasis on the unknowable and incomprehensible rather than straight-up gore. Traditional horror, like slasher movies, can be scary if they cook it just right, but it deals with concepts that are very familiar to us. Jason Voorhees is a guy with an axe, a werewolf is an anthropomorphic wolf-human hybrid, the list goes on. Cosmic horror strives in using concepts that are fundamentally hard to wrap your head around, either due to lack of internal cohesion, or simply because humans as a whole are not used to seeing or dealing with the things and concepts that are being portrayed in the story. Think about it like this. In the beginning of cosmic horror, when it was being pioneered by H.P. Lovecraft himself, the bulk of horror literature were stories that dealt with concepts that were more tangible. Cold Air is a very good example, written by Lovecraft himself, and it's a story that possesses no inhuman monsters whatsoever. Its horror is derived mostly from mystery more than anything else. But in his other works like The Dunwich Horror, Shadows over Innsmouth, and of course Call of Cthulhu, the feeling of horror is derived from trying to explain what a human mind feels when it tries to describe the indescribable. The names and appearances of the monsters in the stories cannot be accurately conveyed through any human language. Their forms can only ever be approximated, and even so, the mental image they paint remains nonsensical and highly variable. The entity known as the Black Goat of the Woods, whose name I'd rather not try to pronounce, is described as an enormous mass which exudes black tentacles, slime-dripping mouths, and short, writhing goat legs. How many mouths and how many legs? Does it have any symmetry, either radial or bilateral? Each person will picture something different when they hear this precisely because there's nothing remotely close to this creature in our real world. Whereas if I were to tell you to imagine a chainsaw-wielding killer, the mental image will have a lot less variety. You probably thought of a guy who was probably tall and burly with a chainsaw and maybe a mask. Or you're a fucking weeb, I don't know. A lot of monsters of cosmic horror and the Lovecraft mythos have traits and characteristics of sea creatures, and that makes sense if you think about it. If you were to teleport to some random landmass on Earth right now, you'd probably have a pretty good grasp of your surroundings, provided it's daytime, of course. Forests, deserts, mountains, the home of our ancestors for millions of years. We look at it, and we can't help but appreciate the natural beauty. It's wild but familiar. Now, if I were to teleport you to some random part of the ocean, well... shit's emptier than my DMs. Have you ever thought about how, for the majority of history, most people had no idea that squids existed? Imagine you're the first person to ever see one. Something like that is undeniably alive and animated, but with an anatomy so radically different from yours that if you were to try to describe it to other people, they would have a really hard time imagining it. And it doesn't even have to be a sea creature, just look at these medieval depictions of elephants. They were probably drawn by an artist who was hearing a description of them. We all know what an elephant looks like, but the person who drew this never saw one in their lives. This goes to show that without a good reference point, the mind's eye can conjure up some really weird things. And I believe this is why so many creatures of cosmic horror are ocean-themed, because back when these stories were first being written, the ocean was even more unexplored than it is now. As for its depths, just forget about it. If the Great Blue Expanse can house things like these, just imagine what else is hidden in the places where the light doesn't reach. But I feel like nowadays this is no longer the case. Now we even have Cthulhu plushies. Classic cosmic horror has become very popular and, funnily enough, rather comprehensible. Considering that it is a type of horror that is supposed to be derived from the alien, the Lovecraftian entities are nowadays quite familiar. But that does not mean the death of cosmic horror. Even classic cosmic horror is still very much alive. We merely need to look at different ways to derive horror from mystery and magnitude. Fundamentally, the terror provoked by cosmic horror derives from a feeling of what the f is happening, and that can be achieved through more means than just squiddy little guides. Allow me to indulge in a little bit of storytelling for a few moments to paint a picture in your head, and I'm sorry if this is shit, I cooked it in 10 minutes. Imagine, if you will, a small idyllic English village in the 18th century. Everything seems fine at first until you find out that every person in that village is terrified of one building in particular. It was a house more isolated from the center of the town, where once lived a reclusive hermit. It had been a very long time since anyone saw any activity coming from the house, but every night some of the neighbors would see that from its interior emanated a faint blue glow. Eventually some people started to complain about a horrendous stench coming from the building, so a few men entered the house to try to see what was going on. They found a body that was nigh unrecognizable, completely covered in burns, rashes and pustules, especially around the hands. He was buried just outside his home, and just a few days later, it was found that the man who carried the body, as well as the gravedigger, had gone sick. Burn marks appeared on their bodies, especially around the hands and arms. They felt lethargic and weak, with vomit and diarrhea stripping their system of any nutrients they tried to consume. Wounds would open and refuse to close, and after they finally perished, it was discovered that their bone marrow had turned to goo. The first theory was that some sort of disease had claimed the men, but the family members looked to be completely fine. Whatever it was that those men had contracted, it had nothing to do with any known pathologic agent. Rather, another theory that had been brewing was that the hermit was a devil worshipper, and that house he inhabited had been cursed due to the excessive blasphemous rituals that took place behind those walls. Even the children who play near the house started to get sick as well. Those who were dared to enter by their friends would have their days counted. The very land seemed to reject life itself, with the vegetation around it growing feeble and weak. And of course, that faint blue glow was ever present, especially at night. It was decided that the whole place should be burned to the ground, and it was. At nightfall, the place was torched and collapsed after a few hours. But interestingly, whatever was contained in that Stygian vault didn't die in the fire. The very opposite happened. It was released. Ashes rained down the village, and with it came the illness. It seemed that no human artifice could contain or rid the world of whatever was causing the disease. A formless, mute demon that is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The village lies abandoned to this very day. The bodies are still there, as no one dares disturb those unhallowed grounds. In case you couldn't deduce from this little story, the thing causing the disease isn't some sort of pathogen or demonic entity. Those are simply hypotheses that could help make sense of whatever is going on inside the house. But the real culprit isn't either of those things. The only thing I'm doing in the story is that I'm trying to describe radiation from the perspective of someone living in the 18th century, someone who would have no idea what it is. The hermit in the story is some guy fiddling with highly radioactive material, and once the house was burned down, that material eventually turned into fallout. Maybe it didn't exactly sound like cosmic horror because I never wrote it, so I'm very inexperienced in that field, but please hear me out. It's some invisible force or spirit that causes you to get extremely sick by just being near it. Something that burns your skin if you get too close. It cannot be seen or heard or touched. How different is this from the influence of an eldritch god? Something that can drive you mad and completely wreck you, but it's such a primordial force that it doesn't even know or care about your existence. The monsters of cosmic horror don't need a physical form. You merely need to see its effects, and above all else, let it be something alien to whoever is experiencing it. But this concept goes even further beyond, as those features can be used to implement cosmic horror elements into stories that have nothing related to it. Let me bring up another example from the previous hyperfixation I had before Genshin and my wife Farina. None other than Armored Core 6. My second most popular video and my most popular short are about this game, so you can bet your ass that I'm gonna milk it. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, if you see this game from a realistic perspective, it's f***ing terrifying. Well, as it turns out, I found another thing that freaks me out about this game, and it isn't derived from physics. This time, I'm referring to the most central element of Armored Core's story, the coral. During my first playthrough, I had a bit of a hard time grasping exactly what coral was, or more importantly, what it represented. But after diving a bit deeper into the story, I believe that coral is one of the best examples of an entity that is so alien we can barely comprehend it as a whole. Well, what is coral? Simply put, it is a type of fuel that is extremely energy dense, self-replicating, sentient and intelligent. This thing is alive, and although it may not have any basis in biology that we can comprehend, it behaves just like a living creature. It's scared of death, and it tries to replicate itself as much as possible. It takes the form not of a tree or an animal or even a coacervate, but rather fire, lightning, and waves. It dwells within the bowels of Rubicon 3 and speaks directly with the consciousness of those who underwent augmentative surgery. And if you perish to one of its influxes of energy, you become a part of it. Your mind, your very soul, will join the countless others that perish to the fires of Ibis. You will become but another cell that will inhabit this formless creature, another voice shouting endlessly amidst the raging crimson flames. In both the examples I gave, the main force that categorizes the theme of a story as cosmic horror is the perspective from which the entity is portrayed. Sure, you can just look at both the things I described and say, oh, this isn't cosmic horror, these are just normal things that are being distorted by the way you're phrasing them. If you think this, congratulations, you understood the point of this video. Almost every story can have a complete change in its genre by simply shifting the focus onto something else or someone else. Seeing one guy completely annihilate a bunch of people can be really cool if you're watching that scene from the perspective of the aforementioned guy. But if you're one of the foot soldiers, one of the goons, all you see is this unstoppable killing machine, completely decimating all of your competent, trained colleagues without even breaking a sweat. This is fear. Armored Core even takes a dab at this in one of the earlier missions, as you see the reaction of some girl seeing you completely wipe out one of their strongest mechs. This is fear. You are cool and badass from your perspective, but from the perspective of everyone else, you're f***ing terrifying. Another good example would be like 80% of rom-coms. From the perspective of the protagonist, you may see them framed as the underdog who's trying their absolute best to get the attention of their love interest. But if you shift the focus to the love interest, maybe tweak a little bit of the prose, you get a story about someone who's either unknowingly or knowingly being obsessed over and stalked. It's all about perspective. Even something like a classic hero's tale turns into a tragedy if you're seeing it from the perspective of the villain who gets defeated in the end. For that precise reason, if you're feeling creative, you can pick up just a few interesting concepts and with some effort you can twist them into something else. Cosmic horror specifically uses this artifice the most, and its most fundamental characteristic is the mystery surrounding it. You can create some really scary stories about cosmic horror without once mentioning anything about ancient curses, Cthulhu, or anything slimy or squid-like. Don't get me wrong, I love those themes, but there's a lot to gain from broadening the spectrum that encompasses cosmic horror. All this to say, let's keep the tentacles to hentai.